Hi, I'm Elizabeth Curry Chandler. I'm a journalist and writer who co-founded the website Goodreads, a community for people like me who live for books. For this podcast, we go back to the basics. One-on-one conversations with authors, artists, explorers, and entrepreneurs. People with big ideas, people who have changed the world. Answering the question, what are the books of your life?
Something amazing has been happening as we've been having these conversations. Similar ideas and magical reading experiences keep popping up from dramatically different people. For example, the genuine sense of escape when reading as a child, or an almost spiritual gratitude for the school library, or how life-altering it can be to read a great book that breaks all the rules of good writing, and to realize that maybe you too can break those rules. Or the way you want to slow down when you're nearing the end of an especially great book, and the sadness, even a sense of mourning, when it's over. This week we're talking to Neil Gaiman, and he hits on many of these themes. He's a writer with an out-of-this-world imagination. He's written the cult favorite American Gods, the Sandman comic book series, Coraline, and countless other films, graphic novels, theater, and television. For the last few years, Neil Gaiman has been living and breathing one of his books as the showrunner for the TV serial adaptation of Good Omens for Amazon. It's an epic Armageddon comedy. An angel and a demon have to find the lost Antichrist, and it's hilariously funny. Gaiman co-wrote the book in 1990 with the beloved fantasy author Terry Pratchett.
I met Terry in January 1985, 4 years before we wrote the book. I was a young journalist. Terry was working in the PR department of the Central Electricity Generating Board, and he'd written a novel called The Color of Magic, which was about to come out in paperback. And I did an interview with him. Nobody else wanted to interview him. And I just remember in the lunch discovering that we had an incredibly similar kind of brain. Let me give you an example. We were talking, somehow the conversation had gone off onto magical grimoires, the books of spells and things like that. And Terry mentioned that in his next book, The Light Fantastic, he was going to have the Necrotelecomnicon, the book of the telephone numbers of the dead, which I thought was hilarious because I'd just written a short story which included the Liber Fulvarum Paginarum, the book of yellow-colored pages. And it was both of us doing the same joke from slightly different angles, but it was that thing of going, oh, you're kind of like me. We have that thing. And I became very quickly somebody that Terry would use to bounce ideas off. So my telephone would ring and a voice would say, hello, it's me. Listen, what's more funny? And I'd listen and I'd say, well, actually, I think this is more funny or whatever. And got very into just bouncing jokes around. There were books of Terry's like Pyramids, where I was practically co-writing, except that I never wrote anything. So I'd written a book called Don't Panic, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Companion. And, I was very lucky getting to work with Douglas Adams. I'd be in Douglas Adams's filing cabinets, reading all his old stuff, and then writing the book. I tried to write it in a very Douglas Adams kind of style. And by the end of the book, it was like, okay, this is classic British humor style. I think I can do this. I know how this one goes. And I wrote 5,000 words, the first 5,000 words of a book which was going to be called William the Antichrist. And I sent it to a few of my friends, just for feedback. And one of the friends I sent it to was Terry. And this is toward the end of 1987, and suddenly DC Comics said yes to a comic called Sandman, and suddenly I'm writing Sandman, and I'm incredibly busy. So about 8 months into Sandman, the phone rings, And a voice says, "Hello, it's me. Listen, that thing that you were writing, I've been thinking about it. Are you doing anything with it?" And I said, "Well, no, my life is filled with Sandman right now, but I will get back to it." And he said, "Well, I know what happens next. So either sell me the idea and the bit of it that you've written, or we could write it together." And by this point, I was a huge admirer of Terry's. I'd watched him crafting. I'd, spoken to him on the phone through several novels, and loved the idea of essentially, feeling like a journeyman writer apprenticed to a master craftsman. So I said, absolutely, let's do it together. And then Terry couldn't find I couldn't find the e-file, the electronic file at the time of that first 5,000 words. I just had a lightning storm that had melted everything down, although I later found it on a disk. But Terry took what I'd sent him and typed it into the computer, and by the time he'd finished, it was the first 10,000 words. And that was how it began.
Well, and there's been quite a break since the novel. It's almost 20 years later that the serial adaptation is coming out. How did that happen?
Well, it's nearly 30 years later. Yeah.
Oh my God. Yes,
no,
nearly
exactly.
30.
Time creeps up on us all. I think some things happen when the time is right, in truth. And with Good Omens, we'd know before it was even published, we'd sold the film rights. Terry and I were in Hollywood. Right now I'm talking to you from a room in the Chateau Marmont.
It's very glamorous.
Which is now I was going to say incredibly fancy, incredibly glamorous. 30 years ago, the film company put Terry and me up in the Chateau Marmont, and it was a sleazy, kind of scummy place where nothing worked. The carpets and everything your feet made sucking noises when they touched the carpet. But this was where we were for Hollywood meetings. The film didn't happen. The film company went off into bankruptcy. Terry Gilliam tried to make a film made, but at the point where he decided to come out to Hollywood and close everybody on giving him money, it was a couple of months after 9/11, and nobody was going to make a story about the end of the world. And eventually, the thing that made it happen was Terry Pratchett had Alzheimer's. We talked to several leading showrunners and writers, and had talked about the idea of one of them doing Good Omens. Terry and I knew that we weren't going to do it. We were much too busy, and we only did things together. And then, as the Alzheimer's continued creeping up on Terry, he wrote to me, and he said, "Look, I know how busy you are, but you're the only person with the same passion for and understanding of the old girl that I have, and you have to do this." And he said, he wanted to see it before the lights went out. So I said yes, very reluctantly. And then Terry went into a coma and died, which came as a huge surprise. I thought we had 5, maybe 10 years, and that the race was going to be getting it made while Terry could still enjoy it. And instead, I left his funeral in April 2015, and I started writing episode 1. And nothing felt very funny at the time.
Yeah.
But I knew that I had to do it for Terry, and it became this kind of holy mission. If that doesn't sound too pretentious or silly. If I was going to do it, I was damn well going to do it. I'd made myself showrunner just so that I could do the casting, so that I could say no to somebody who wanted to cut out a scene because they thought it would be easier if they cut that scene out, or whatever. So that was the way that I was going to play it.
Wow, that sounds like a true mission.
It was, and we were also incredibly lucky at the time. I think trying to make Good Omens for television 20 years ago, even a decade ago, would have been almost impossible. A lot of what allowed it to happen was the budget that Amazon was able to come up with, the advances in technology. The thing about the CGI in Good Omens is it's not the stuff that you think that's really impressive. It's not the flaming motorways and driving a Bentley in flames and, the Garden of Eden. That's the stuff that's astonishing. For me, it's things like the street in Soho. I know that we filmed it on a very small abandoned airbase where we built basically a Zero Fails shop and a couple of storefronts and a little street. Maybe, if it went for 50 feet, that was probably all it went for. And the digital beauty that gives us that amazing street in Soho, which looks like we shut down central London for several days in order to film. That's the mastery of the kind of VFX that they can do now. And we couldn't have had that before.
I really like the dialogue. I like the British humor poking at evil in sort of a fun, cheeky way. I noticed in some of your books, you do identify evil. You point it out. Is that something that you enjoy doing in particular?
It is. I don't think there's anything wrong with I mean, one of the wonderful things about being a writer is you get to be God. You may or may not take a moral stand or an overt moral stand in your fiction. But it's really nice to be able to write funny dialogue that also makes people think. And the wonderful thing about what Terry Pratchett and I did all those years ago is we wrote funny dialogue that actually had a philosophical point, had a theological point, actually makes sense. I think we said some things that were big and important. And you don't get to do that very often in your life. So I wanted to make sure that the things that we said, made it onto the television. And also I had David Tennant and Michael Sheen delivering lines. So everything that I wrote comes across as 1,000 times better than I wrote it because I have those two being brilliant.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the books that have shaped your life. The first question I had was, why do you read?
I think I read now for different reasons to the reasons I used to. I mean, when I was a kid, I read because it was escape. Very literally escape. I didn't have to be where I was. Whether I was at school, whether I was at home, whether I was traveling, every book was a doorway. And every book was a doorway into a place either that I hadn't been before or that I'd been and loved and wanted to go back to. And that, for me, was, nothing could be finer than that. And I also read, I think, when I was young to try and understand the world, to try and understand the adult world, to try and figure out why people did what they did, what was going on, what the secrets were, what the instructions were. Here we go. I turned up on this planet without actually an instruction manual. Fiction was the nearest thing that I had. So that was huge. These days, I read for different reasons. I've been creating fiction professionally for my entire adult life now. And so when I'm reading, I think it must be like a magician going to see a magic show. You're going to admire the way that something is done, but you're not going to worry that poor lady has been cut in half. Anybody, any writer who can actually make me worry that lady has been cut in half gets on my "you are very special" list. Jonathan Carroll can always make me worry about his people. Stephen King can always make me worry about his people and actually care about them as people, not as fictional constructs. Anybody who can jerk me out of going, yes, that's a beautiful sentence, and get me to go, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? And I need to turn that page, get sort of, special bonus points from me.
I think it's interesting, actually, the more you read, or I watch a lot of dance, and somebody actually moving you, regardless of the technique or the ability, that it becomes more and more special. Like, to get you to feel something as you get older is powerful and impressive.
It really does. I've been rereading recently because he died very recently, a lot of Gene Wolfe and a lot of his short stories. And, mostly just admiring the artistry, admiring the brilliance, admiring the way that he does it. And then every now and then it's like a knee to the groin, and it hurts, and there are emotions, and, I'm always grateful to Gene from beyond the grave for that.
I read that you blurbed his book. Did you know him personally, too?
I did. I met Gene Wolfe. The first time I met Gene Wolfe, I was 22 years old. And I was an incredibly young journalist interviewing him on the publication of his book, The Citadel of the Autarch, which was the last book in the Book of the New Sun sequence. And he was very kind to I'm sure, very ignorant, very foolish 22-year-old, but with enthusiasm. And we stayed friends. And we stayed, I think, good friends over the years. He would come to my house. I would go to his, although he lived a fair distance away. And most recently, I got to go to his funeral.
What do you think it is about his books that changed you or shaped your perspective?
I think the Book of the New Sun and another book of Gene's called Peace, in some ways, I think, taught me how to read, or taught me how to read in a different way. The first time I read Peace, I read it as a very sweet memoir of a life spent in the Midwest. I couldn't quite figure out why there were Gaiman Wilson skeletons behind the word peace on the cover. When I read it again a few years later, I was halfway through it, and I remember sitting up suddenly and going, hang on, he killed them, and realizing that every major character who disappears in the book was murdered, probably by our narrator, who is actually dead, because there's textural indication, if you read it closely, to realize that actually he's been dead for a long time and has now woken up as a ghost and is sort of walking through a memory house. And realizing I'm reading a completely different book to the book I read the first time. And loving the fact that that was something that happened on rereading. The Book of the New Sun, which is 4 volumes with a sort of 5th volume closer called The Earth of the New Sun, is, the first time you read it, the story of a young torturer in the far, far, far future who is exiled from the Torturers Guild for showing mercy, who goes off into the world of the far future and essentially winds up becoming the autarch, the king of this whole area. And you realize that on a second read through, you start to spot inconsistencies. You start to realize how unreliable our narrator, Severian, is, despite the fact that he tells us he has perfect memory. You realize, well, yes, he does, but he also lies by omission a number of times during the text. And you start to notice things that Gene built in. And I realized that Gene was the first time I realized that a writer was writing to be reread, to give you one experience on reading and one on rereading. And that, for me, as a young writer, became huge.
You also talked about Lud in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees. And I noticed that several of the books you recommended were all published at the turn of the century. So how did you come across that book, and why is it important to you?
Lud in the Mist is a fascinating book, published in, I think, the late 1920s. I found it as a reprint. The Ballantine adult fantasy series reprinted this book. And I read it probably when I was 11 or 12 years old. And again, it haunted me, partly because I felt it showed me what fiction could do. The first 70 pages of Lud in the Mist begin as a kind of travelogue. It breaks every single rule you're told about show, don't tell. Instead, it begins just by telling you calmly, assuredly, and beautifully about this place and the history of this place and what it is. And then a story slowly starts. And then the story moves and it becomes an allegory of some kind. It becomes a detective story. It becomes a ghost story. And at the end, it becomes a sort of something about the reconciliation of the mundane and the miraculous, of the everyday world and the world, in Lord Dunsany's terms, beyond the fields we know. And it made a huge impression on me. It felt real. It felt like a novel that was shaped just for me. And whenever I run into people who've run across and love Lud in the Mist, I know they're going to be my kind of people.
Do you believe in fairies?
It depends whether you're talking about them as a metaphor or as reality. Do I believe that there are really little winged people who flit around doing magic at the bottom of the garden? Absolutely not. Do I believe in fairy as representing the poetic urge, the madness, in the Lud in the Misty terms, the whole sexual fairy fruit side of things that liberates us from the workaday mundane world in which we exist? Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about the William series, Just William by Rishmal Compton.
Yeah, so the Just William books, when you asked for books that had, changed my life, I thought, well, actually, the Just William books changed my life, but they changed it in a very strange way, because I loved these books when I was a kid. I had copies inherited from my mother and from my aunts, wrapped in old wallpaper, and these glorious books that I would read and reread. And when I got older, I was probably in my mid-20s, I kept pondering the William books, this stories of this free-spirited 11-year-old with his little gang, the Outlaws, and his dog Jumble. And somewhere in there, I thought, wouldn't it be great to do a story called William the Antichrist, in which this 11-year-old kid turns out to be, the whole Omen thing about this Damien, they've got the wrong kid. And actually, it's just this kid growing up in the Oxfordshire countryside, causing trouble with his gang of friends. And that was a book that I started writing and sent to my friend Terry Pratchett.
Wow.
And that was the book that Terry called me up on and said, here, are you doing anything more with that? Do you want to do it together? So the very first draft of Good Omens was still called William the Antichrist.
And I read a couple of these and they're really funny.
I was going to say that for me is, the prose on a simple sentence by sentence level and in plotting, I think Richmal Crompton was actually the equal of P.G. Wodehouse.
Yeah.
She wasn't recognized as being the equal of P.G. Wodehouse, A, because Wodehouse was a man, and B, because she was writing stories ostensibly aimed at children, despite the fact that mostly what she's doing is a sort of a 1930s and 40s social satire.
Yeah.
The adults are always the butt of the joke, the adults who believe in reincarnation, or the adults who have become vegetarians or whatever, and inflict this stuff on William and his friends.
Yeah, one reader, I was looking at the reviews, called it a glorious evocation of childhood and subtle social commentary. I just think it's funny because when you talked about reading to learn the rules, you see this kid kind of grasping at the rules and, getting it all wrong as he's figuring out the adult world.
Absolutely, which was what I loved about it as a kid, because I could read the William stories and he made the mistakes that I didn't have to.
Yeah. The other book that you mentioned was The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you found that book?
I found it in the school, as I found so many books, in the school library. And the school library, I think it had been stocked in about 1910, and again in about 1935, and again in about 1955, which meant they had these battered first edition copies of The Hobbit and of all three books of Lord of the Rings. Actually, only the first two books of Lord of the Rings. I had to win the school English prize in order to find out how it ended. And I got a copy of The Return of the King.
That's motivation.
It was. Well, they had the Fellowship of the Ring and they had the Two Towers. So I just read those two books over and over again, going, I wonder how it finishes. So I found the Man Who Was Thursday on those shelves, read it and loved it, and discovered it was a book that I could go back to every 5 years and still love it. And it's a very, very peculiar novel in which a man is recruited as an anarchist who isn't. He's a poet, and finds himself very rapidly being made part of a cell of spies who name themselves after the days of the week. And their chief is a huge and mysterious man called Sunday, who also turns out to be the man who recruited each of them to spy on the anarchists in the first place, who may also be God. I was fascinated by the nightmare nature of the book. And I also became more and more fascinated, and Terry and I bonded talking about that book. We both loved it. And one of the things we loved about it was that in many ways, The Man Who Was Thursday is the template for most of the spy fiction of the latter half of the 20th century, in which you discover that everybody who thinks they're on different sides are actually on the same side, and that the police may well also be the anarchists, that you genuinely don't know who you're working for.
I read that the author was quite religious, as is Gene Wolfe. I noticed two of the authors. Do you find that sphere very interesting? I mean, you seem to be interested in good and evil and morality, shades of morality.
I am, although, I find Gene Wolfe and G.K. Chesterton both shared a sort of huge fondness for Catholicism and the complexities of Catholicism, which I think a lot like Judaism force you to get in there and start chewing and arguing and figuring things out for yourself to some extent. I'm much less interested in anything which is part of the sort of the baby bird school of morality, in which somebody else goes and chews up the moral worms for you and then sort of drops them into your gaping jaw.
Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. And I hope I see you again one of these days.
You are so welcome. I look forward to it.
Today we spoke about The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, Just William by Rishmal Crompton, The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton, and Blood in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Books of Your Life is produced by me, Elizabeth, with Melissa Yeager-Miller, and with help from Danny Fakis and Sybil Wallace.